Yeah.
And thank you.
Now I was excited I'm happy it worked out with scheduling that we could be here and talk. I mean, we speak a lot on occasion, and we've talked a lot throughout your art making time.
Yeah.
And we've actually met. Before we met, people told me about this guy who they thought I looked like. Or looked like a younger version of me.
Yeah. And before we met, the same.
Yeah. They're like, you don't know, so like we finally met, we talked a lot about just what you were doing, where you were starting out, and when we first met, and I really saw your work in person was first at Lower East Side Print Shop. And I was doing a residency, I was actually there doing a print project with them, and you were doing a residency, right? Was it a residency?
Yeah, it was like the residency, and then like into that I started renting space there like after it ended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember the beginning of this work. The very beginning. It was like the very, very beginning. And I remember coming to the studio and seeing the works, and I think they were on paper, right? They were on paper. And we were talking a little bit about direction, where they could go, how far they could go. We were talking about different options. And what I just noticed about your work and talking, your ideas more so than what you were making, is I felt that your work was really, it's interesting to see your work evolve now into what it is, because I always felt like just by looking at the little things that I saw and hearing you talk about your work, it seemed like you were really, really more into the experimental practice of art making and not just object making. And so it was great to see the evolution of this work and the narrative behind the work, which we can talk about, becoming this experience here in this space and taking on all these different forms and being communicated through all these different types of material.
All right.
So you say a little bit about like the beginning when you first started, and up to now.
So I mean, at that point, it was sort of in this transition between like going from thinking about photography as like, making images through a lens and taking pictures, to really considering what like photography is as a material, and thinking about like paper and like the surface, and just like moving beyond making at the time like inkjet prints, and like digital like Photoshop sort of stuff. And the residency at the Lower East Side Print Shop was like super great because it like allowed me access to all these new techniques that like I had no prior experience with. Silk screen was one, and cyanotype came in at this early stage, thinking about like this story, thinking about the characters, and thinking about myself within the narrative. That was the sort of point from jump of like, how can I intervene or place myself within this story to like just sort of create something new from just like brushing up against it. And
because in the beginning it was mostly depicting you as this character.
In the beginning it was like very it was very like sort of focused and limited in terms of like I was thinking about like two characters in like two figures in a sort of pictorial plane, sort of confronting each other, or like thinking about or showing them thinking about their relationship to each other. And the rule was that they couldn't touch each other, because I wanted to show this sort of relationship beyond just like, them hugging or, giving each other like a high five or something, and
so are they communicating with each other, or they're occupying the same space but in different worlds?
They're in the same space and they're conscious of each other and they're communicating. They're trying to really understand each other, because there's this sort of confrontation or encounter between one figure that's rendered in this black and silver sort of silkscreen process, and the other figure is like rendered in this tonal cyanotype process.
And what are the differences between the variation of blue representation versus the grayscale representation?
The blue representation really comes out of this relationship to nature, relationship to music and time, keeping time. And the blue is really sort of encompassing this character Enkidu, who is this sort of wild man that is born in nature and grew up with animals. And he sort of prefigures the biblical Adam in this way of like, you know, being completely just sort of out of the human experience and just in nature. And then the silk screen process, that's like more based on like a matrix. It's more based on like a frame, is representing Gilgamesh. That's this sort of functionary in civilization. You know, he's a king. He's a part of sort of a political system of a city. You know, he has this sort of presence and obligation and duty to his people. You know, so it's sort of thinking about these two processes like in the metaphor of these two individuals that meet, you know, total opposites, but they look exactly the same.
So I, you know, I remember we were talking about that part of well, starting off with that in your practice, kind of using your self-representation and seeing these two figures kind of represented as similar but very different in certain ways and playing very particular roles in the composition of the work. What I really enjoyed seeing and seeing more so now, starting off, is your commitment to really utilizing the palette, and that the blue that's been consistent since the time that we met. And I was saying before to you that this is pre-Columbia grad school. And I'm happy that I wrote the recommendation. I was a little too going home. Really cool. And you got in, which I thought would be great. When I saw your work, I realized that, you know, when you are at a program like that and you see a certain level of potential, and knowing the program and knowing the facilities, I thought that where you were as an artist at the time would have been really beneficial to have that experience there, because I knew that the place you were at the time was really the beginning of the investigation of not only content but form. And I felt that having the experience of being in a place where multidisciplinary practice was really promoted, it would really transform into variations of the idea.
Right.
And looking at the work in this show, to me, really kind of prove what I was thinking. I think that looking at the exhibition and seeing some of the loosely conceptual works, I think are as compelling or even more compelling as the figurative works in some ways, because it really deals with like more of a psychological space.
Right.
And it also points to the idea of atmosphere and weather and just more of a place, like a mystical place, a place that's not really defined, a place that's really more imaginative. Because I really feel like this previous work kind of came out of this idea of fantasy, and I think that the works that are even more current really capitalize off of this idea of fantasy and imagination and fantasticalness, and also mysticism, not in a whimsical way, but more in a very spiritual way, you know, or at least alluding to this idea of spirituality in the sense of how we see it, or how we may think about it. And so,
I mean, the thing about like making art for me, it's about a level of devotion. Like you have to like come back to it, you know what I mean, and like sort of follow through on ideas, or you know, if a idea sort of starts, or if there's a spark, then it's sort of, you know, really on you to sort of see it through, you know what I mean? And I think like the making these works and like in the studio, it's sort of like really a process of trial and error, like most of the time, and that's why I love printmaking and sort of working with these methods, is because like you know, you can sort of do something and learn from it, you know, and then like fail intentionally again, you know, and there's sort of like a poetics to it, you know, of like, you know, you sort of shoot, you know, yourself 19 times, but you know, it doesn't work out, and that's something else, you know what I mean? But then you like do it again and you do it again and you sort of refine it. So it's I don't go to the gym ever, but it's sort of like level of like coming back to it. And I think like, you know, one of the artists that really sort of, you know, like sort of redefined what it means to sort of implicate oneself in a work is Adrian Piper, you know, and the Food for the Spirit series of like, you know, how do you sort of read, you know, or like encounter a work through like a written work, you know, and then sort of like implicate yourself in that. And I think she went about that in like a really amazing way, of which, you know, it was about this sort of like self-reflection and self-seclusion, and really being like in the work, like in a serious way, you know. And for me with the Gilgamesh epic, it was more so it just kept my attention for a really long time. You know, and that was something that like I had to really follow through on. It was just like, you know, this story, it's in one sense, you know, generic because it prefigures all stories, so it has all these like elements. And then on another sense, you know, it's very available. It's like you can Google it, it's online, it's available to everybody, you know. But it's like, you know, why is this having such an impact on me right now in 2000 whenever, you know, and why do I feel compelled to enter this narrative, you know, create new art, new visual artworks from it, you know, and sort of like really understand what it means to have, you know, a Black epic experience, you know, like in a highly imaginative way, you know. And it's on one sense like escapism, sure, but on another sense it's a real sort of turn to history, you know, and a history that you know, we don't necessarily have access to, you know, because one, it's so distant, and two, it's like wrapped up in this like epic literature, you know. You got like really the only way you can really access this is through a class, you know, or that's the way it's taught, you know. But it was really just like me and this work like over the past like 4 years, you know. And
it's, you know, and speaking of the progression of the work, like I'm looking at this piece and I'm really, it's one of the pieces I like a lot in the show. And when I came to the opening, what really stuck out to me in this particular piece is the layers of entry, of manipulation of the material, the screening on the fabric, the copper looking paint is orange or copper. There's a certain type of kind of metaphysical existence that this piece has because it's using all of these different types of color combinations and compositional structures that really resonate just on a human level, being familiar with material and surface and the human body. And although this is not a photograph, it still represents the figure in a photographic way. And as a portrait, but it also has some of the same type of impact as a portrait, as a photographic portrait would have, more so than some of the other works in the exhibition that's more getting more abstract, more conceptual. Although this is a very conceptual piece, I see it more kind of connected to the works over here that represent the body in a more substantial way. So, when in the series did this piece come?
This piece came probably in maybe like 2 years after these pieces in the frame. And this piece came in sort of the second year of grad school. And so, you know, but it was really one of the pieces that was in the studio the whole time, you know, and just being like added to really slowly. And the actual print was a body print where I laid down on the paper, and it happened during the last like great American eclipse or whatever. You know? So, you know, when I sort of like understood that, okay, this celestial event is happening, and my work is really dealing with sunlight and sort of atmosphere and all this stuff, it's like, this is a great opportunity to capture something. So during the eclipse, I just like went out on the roof, coated the paper, laid down on it for like half an hour, and then got this impression. But then I wanted to sort of, I felt like a lot of like aura from it. Like there was something different about the quality of the light, and the sort of quality of the blue, that was like really unique. I hadn't seen that sort of shade up until that point. So I really wanted to follow through on it and sort of bring out this this sense of like this character that's like, you know, potentially like you don't know where they are, you know, they're just in their own environment, and it's like you could be underwater, you could be in a forest, and it's sort of like evoking this sense of radiance and aura.
So I'm sure the question that people may be wondering here, why blue? Why all of this blue? Like, why not other colors in the work? Like, why is blue such a prominent part of the palette in this work?
Well, I mean, back again, you know, blue is, it's a part of that sort of level of spirituality. You know, it's a level of regalness, seriousness, and playfulness at the same time. You know, it's sort of like the atmosphere, it's like sort of always around us. It can, and it has this level of shade, right? Like it can go from, you know, this sort of deeper black, like in this piece, you know, where it's actually blue, but it's just like a super dark blue, like almost black, like space or something. And then, you know, it can be as bright or as light as like the sky, you know. And so it has this sort of, it has the ability to be a character on its own. And working on the project, you know, I realized that, you know, at first it was just about like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, it was just about these two characters. But then in sort of working through that, I realized that it's, the material itself is a character, and it has this sort of potential to transform and to be sort of not only applied on paper in a photographic way, like in the early frame pieces, but, you know, to be poured on paper, you know, to be like scratched into, like in this piece back here, you know, to be sort of mixed with cement and then like poured onto, you know, another structure that's then attached to the paper. So it really sort of became this, it had its own voice within this sort of bigger story of, you know, epic poetry like Gilgamesh, and then sort of me as an artist sort of like trying to sort of really read this work and understand it through this medium, you know.
So at what point in your practice did the transformation from paper to fabric become part of the extension of your practice, and why? Like, why wasn't printmaking on paper enough?
Yeah. Well, the thing about fabric is just like it has this sort of, like literally everyone in this room is wearing fabric right now. You know, it like has this sort of way of getting through the sort of like barrier, you know, of like, that's that and this is me, you know. As that level of relation, and I think like the fabric work came at this point where really it was like a collaborative project, and it was like Sonia had a sort of major performance piece at the Whitney Museum.
I was there for that. Yeah.
You were there, and maybe some people were in the room were there for that too. Yeah, that was really amazing. And not only like was it an opportunity to explore fabric work collaboratively with like many hands in it at the same time, and teaching people what cyanotype is, how to apply it, you sort of how to draw with it, and having like different energies within one piece. It was also a major sort of breakthrough in terms of thinking about music too, like and sound as a part of the experience of the work. So I think that was definitely like the point of departure for like a deeper exploration into fabric, into sort of collaboration and sound and gesture, and just thinking about those things.
Well, what I kind of take from the show and the objects that are installed and the fabric pieces that are hanging is that unlike the works that are on the wall and that are paper, the fabric pieces kind of add to this idea of creating space and creating environment. And it's kind of really going back to like more of the necessity of creating space through very minimal gestures. And the patterning in the fabric also remind me just of a lot more traditional tribal appliqué and pattern. But on the other hand, it also reminds me of more of a very abstract form that I think also goes back and forth between like your desire to tell a story versus your desire to deal with very formal constructs in abstract painting and abstract art, which I think are both very different, but also refreshingly challenging position to be in. Because I also think about those things when I'm making work about speaking and how to speak through visual culture and how visual culture can transform things that are abstract into formal and vice versa. So one of the things that I noticed is how these fabric pieces convey another sense of participation from the audience versus the works that are more observational. And so could you speak a little bit on that? Because at the opening you had like a thing in the yard that it was a kind of an umbrella thing that kind of flowed and had fabric. And some of the fabric pieces that are here that aren't necessarily attached to the wall suggest a sense of like space.
Well, this idea of holding space or creating space really comes out of, thinking about the material itself, like cyanotype being linked to architecture. Because in the 19th century, architects used cyanotypes to make blueprints. And sort of it has this tradition of sort of architectural planning and sort of creating structures to really hold space for something else. It could be like a museum to hold space for art, or a home to hold space for a whole life experience in a family. So thinking about that link, it was like, how can I sort of use this medium to sort of hold space for people to interact with the story, and then reflect on their own sort of engagement with, where really every sort of action, every look, every sort of touch has, a sort of really heavy and deep meaning. Like not really heavy and deep, but more so like significant and emotional meaning to sort of in relation to the figures, and then in relation to like the universe, the cosmos. It's like this sort of idea of like a box within a box within a box, that sort of expands outward, and creating an experience that sort of like moves from sort of a really central specific like focal point in terms of like the Epic of Gilgamesh into sort of many forms and many sort of relations, and because it's out in the world, it's like.
Well, tell me a little bit about the collaboration you did. I guess with the fabric, starting off with the fabric, being a part of Sonia's performance, and how that kind of informed this next step of kind of thinking about the fabric as being an additional component to your practice, and thinking about it. Cause you were still in school when you were?
No, that was before. That was like right before school.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like
so.
2006.
Tell me a little bit of how, when you start to think about the work and think about the two-dimensional elements of printmaking and photography with the work, how did the fabric become this additive part of it that you saw relevant to? Because usually when you're working on certain things as an artist and you're working one type of way, usually when you decide to consider implementing another material, it's when you realize that one thing you're doing is doing one thing, or is doing one particular thing, and how your interest in having another conversation requires you to think about other material. And so when the works were 2D and flat on the wall, which some of them are now, at what point when you realized that the fabric and the things that were hanging was of interest in order for you to kind of have a more extended conversation about your practice moving forward from, again, starting with very two-dimensional objects, going to more
picture experience, and like a sculptural experience where you can, you know, sort of walk around it. And, you know, with Shake the Stars with Your Song, like, it's, that was the title of the performance project, and it was a day, it was like an afternoon on the Whitney Terrace, like outside, and it was like 9 musicians, you know, playing live, and
readers.
Yeah, readers, and it was a like sort of disciplinary installation that like, and what was cool about it was like it went up really fast and it came down really fast, and even the way it came down was like through the collaboration of like everybody that attended, like helping to sort of bring it to a close. But the like creating the fabric works with, you know, with myself, with Sonia, with Tamara, with Taja, with Austin, with, you know, just so many different hands in the work, where it was more so not me making anything, but sort of me sort of like facilitating like a group of musicians to make visual work, you know what I mean? To make t-shirts and their own costumes and stuff like that. So that was the point where I really understood and, you know, fell in love with this idea of, you know, fabric, you sort of breaking this barrier and it not being this, this sort of like, you know, it has like many other associations other than like paper and printmaking and fine art, and you know, it's like
a more tangible object for people who are not artists.
Yeah, exactly.
Think about art.
You know, so you can like make this thing and then wear it and like feel like it's yours. You know.
Yeah, you can touch it.
Yeah, and seeing that was like sort of like, you know, power. It's like, oh, like this sort of working with fabric, you know, rather than, you know, let's say, you know, a huge like canvas piece. You know, it's just a different level of engagement. And one that I saw, you know, really, you know, touched people that, you know, were creative, but not necessarily like in that sense, like visually creative, and especially like not, you know, advanced in the sort of like medium of cyanotype. You know, they learned it like we went on this retreat like for a weekend up in Beacon, and like, you know, we had like a sort of little workshop where I showed everyone how to do it, and they just took it on their own, and that was like really, really great.
Have you worked with after doing the presentation, is there any people from that experience that you continue to collaborate with, or was it just like something you did as like a workshop just for?
Well, it was like the workshop for the performance, and then it sort of, you know, really, I feel like, you know, it happened maybe 2 years ago now, and it really like brought these like amazing people together that are all doing amazing things right now, and it's like really exciting. Yeah. It's sort of like legendary. Like shout out to Sonia, because like it really was a really special moment, I think, in like all of our lives, like as creatives, you know, working on that scale and that space. And you know, since then it really brought me into, it sort of gave me confidence to work in sound myself, you know, because up until that point I was like, you know, I'm not a musician, like I don't have like any sort of like business dealing with that, like that thing, But then, I had all these musicians making visual work, and they were wearing. So I was like, this is, if they can come this way, I can, go that way. So it really opened up the floodgates for, experimentations in sort of sound and like performance and. And really thinking about, music and sound as a material, in the same way as paper or fabric,
Yeah, because you've been doing like more experimental sound.
Yeah.
Some performances, collaborations, dealing with sound and more of a happening. Actually reminds me a lot of some of the documentation of the artists from LA Objects, Under the Highway, Singing the Goody.
Yeah, Singing the Goody,
what's the other artist name? I can't remember her name. Maren Hessinger, even David. And back in the day, the images of them kind of doing like improvisational performances under the highway in LA. Yeah. Just since I got from seeing some of the performances, it was very much like very collaborative, improvisational.
Yeah, I mean, and they really happen in these spaces that aren't sort of traditional music venues. Like, it sort of happens in a way that's really sort of, put together and then taken apart. And, I was able to really experiment more with this idea of happenings with the band I'm in. It's called 3, and sort of formed in grad school. Is like a sort of punk, loud, terrible,
so it's all
but amazing music.
Is it original? Is it instruments or is it digital?
It's instruments. So we have a singer, Meg Turner, who's like an amazing vocalist and like sick printmaker, and then like we have like drums, but it's not really drums. It's like it's like a bucket, and then and then like cymbals but and I play keys, and we have a guitarist, Ana Rivera, who's like actually the like sort of heart of the band. And doing sort of rehearsing and sort of creating music, really as artists in a visual art program. We don't have to do this. This is like nobody's making us.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the program. Tell us a little about your experience in grad school. Do you think it was really beneficial for you moving forward as an artist? Do you think that the experience of being there for the 2 years really helped to develop some of your ideas as we see them now, and were they helpful?
Yeah, 100%. It was like super helpful to just have the time to be really immersed in my own practice and like world, But that's the sort of like ideal that you like go to grad school for. But then once you're actually there, it's not about you. It's like it's actually not about being in the studio. Really, everything is there to keep you out of the studio. But
the balance is being able to do both.
Yeah.
I think grad school. I think my experience, and I remember. John Kessler, who was there, because he's still there now.
Yeah, he's still there. Yeah, he's
but students complained about having all these interruptions in their studio, and he said to most of the students, he said, "Listen, this is probably the only time you're going to have that many people who want to get into your studio. So you better enjoy it right now."
Or even have a studio.
And if you're able to entertain interruptions and still be productive, that's what most successful artists do. Most artists are not able to just be in their studio making art all the time. There's other parts of it.
Yeah, many other parts.
There's a lot of interruptions.
You know what I mean?
But in general, the program and just the collaborations that happen within the program, you think were really
super fruitful and like really amazing. And the thing about the program is like retrospectively looking back, it was like sort of these pivotal moments where that like really forced you into a position. And it's not like you had to sort of choose what sort of position you would take, you know, whether it was like, you know, offensive or defensive, you know, in that moment. But I just remember there were like these benchmarks of like, okay, like, you know, I've worked up until this moment, you know, and then there's like this thing or like this visit or this, you know, sort of external opportunity that, you know, I really need to, just really need to follow through on and be strategic about, you know, it's sort of, you know, the idea of strategy really came into play too, of like just sort of seeing a multitude of different art practices, you know, like how people just went about things, you know.
Do you think grad school was is important?
I mean, it depends on what kind of conversation you want to have as an artist, and sort of, you know, just what kind of conversation you want to have. I think it was important for me to do it, and the experiences I got out of it and the people that I were able to talk to and just like be with was really great. But I wouldn't say like it's for every single artist, you know. It just sort of depends on what sort of what level of engagement you want, you know, to have. And I'm not saying like going to grad school is like the highest level, but it definitely helps to put you in the orbit of, you know, people and other artists and like curators and people like Kelly Jones, you know. It's like you know, it's like really, come on, you know what I mean? It's like it's hard. It's like it's just difficult to sort of get in, you know, the atmosphere of these people. And, you know, in my first year of grad school, like that, my work sort of became about sort of this idea of sort of like a solar system, you know, and sort of like these, like really sort of paying like homage to the different artists I was studying at the time and creating work about them, or like in sort of the vein of a portrait of them, you know. And there were like these sort of star systems that were just sort of
totally
mapped out. So, you know, it really sort of helps you to see, you know, who you want to talk to in terms of like living artists, you know, artists that are no longer with us, and, you know, and then even like going way, way, way back and sort of how you want to engage in that longer conversation. So yeah, I mean, you know, anybody that's really thinking about doing grad school, just like apply to it. It's always there. You know what I mean? It's not going anywhere. You know, so
usually when you're thinking about, you know, just trajectory as an artist and thinking about where you want to be, who you want to be in conversation with, I think the things you were saying are definitely very relevant to consider. And also, as you came into the program, you came in mostly as a printmaker. Was that what you came, or you came in through?
I came in through printmaking, and I always sort of said, like, among the, like, there's 4 printmakers that get in each year, and among the 4, I was definitely like the least printmaking printmaker, but you know, Anna, Meg, and Emma, the other 3 printmakers were like just really brilliant and really fun, and it was just a really great time. Like actually, like just working with them. And I mean, you were in printmaking also.
No, it was New Genre.
You were New Genre.
Maybe I did printmaking there, but
New
Genre. But you know, Tomasa was there, right?
Right. Yeah. But like you have this in school. You have this like sort of, you know, sort of cohort. You know, this sort of small. Sort of circle.
It doesn't really matter what happens once you get into the program. And again I was really surprised and you know, refreshingly surprised to see the transformation of your work from being in grad school, that I think was really beneficial for you as an artist, because a lot of your work, a lot of the content and the narrative behind a lot of your work, I saw as being very transformative in many ways, and it didn't really need to be one particular thing. And I felt that having the experience of speaking about some of your ideas and being in places that would challenge your ideas more with really benefit the level and the transformation of your ideas into these, what we see now,
Right.
what we see in the space,
Yeah.
how we engage within the space, and seeing that this is really just the beginning of your ride.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like that was really well said. I mean, it was. I'd say the difference between not going to grad school and going to grad school is like you really learn how to talk about your own work, because a place like Columbia, there's like multiple visits, like all the time. You know, like even when you don't want them, like they're still coming, and it's this sort of balance between, you know, working and sort of, you know, engaging with the work and then speaking with it. And before that, it was more so me writing about the work, because I would like write to residencies and write to grants and write to, you know, people about the work, and it was all written. You know, and then it, you know, in grad school it became less about writing about the work and more about talking about it and responding to it in real time, you know. And yeah, it was just really, it was like a different kind of fuel. It was like moving at a different rhythm, and engaging with the work like in the studio, and I think it was really helpful because it was like sort of moving from like soul music to like disco. It was like this super fast, like, you know, full body experience, you know, where somebody come into the studio and say some crazy shit, and you're like, no, you know, and then the opposite, you know, but
you learn, you know, I think you learn more so as an artist when you have visits and you have people coming by and people who are considered professionals, and they give you their response to what they see in your work. You get a broader sense of how your work is interpreted.
100%.
Beyond like your peer group.
100%.
Who usually could be more celebratory. You kind of get a sense of what the world is and how the world will look at the work beyond your group. And I think that experience is, you know, is clear in looking at the work in the show, because you can just see that you're at a particular place now as an artist where you are really interested in what the material can do and what the material can say and how it can be manipulated and how it can work for you as an artist, but also how it can become many different things to different people through experiences and through different forms of execution. You know, like I look at this exhibition and I see more of a blueprint. Funny because it's blue. A blueprint of like many different exhibitions to come. Like I see the fabric works and I see them as installation on its own. I see some of the other works that are two-dimensional works as objects on its own, and I also see them collectively. And so, should we open up to anyone? Any questions? How's the time? We're good?
I think it's great. We can open up to some questions.
Any questions here for any one of us?
Yeah, sure.
I have a question. I really like, Derrick, that you brought up that piece on the left, because it just sticks out so crazy. And like, I have a question for Ivan. Like, I just love the fact that you just told us that you like the whole concept behind it, because like you sat down. Also, it was like the eclipse, right?
Yeah.
Can you like tell us more about like just like what you were thinking as you had it in the studio and like the process? You know, you went through kind of looking at it and like adding to it over time.
Well, I'll say like on the day the eclipse was happening, I didn't have like the idea to do a print, and I like was in the studio. I just got to the studio, was like really hot, and then I like went out to the river on 125th Street, and then I saw these people like they had this like you know, like the pasta or like the rice colander with the little holes in it, like seeing the sort of transition of the sun, and this guy was like, yo, you want to see this? Like, look at the shadow. And the second I saw that, it was like all these little suns in these little circles, and I was like, holy shit, wait, like, I need to capture my own shadow. And then I like rushed back to the studio and did it, and then, you know, it really was just like in the place that it was for a really long time, like over like maybe even 6 months or something. And so like with the figure, I wanted to make a portrait. I realized I wanted to make a portrait of the forest guardian Humbaba, who the two characters are assassinating in this piece. But I really wanted to sort of think about this character in his own sort of element, you know, like in a space before, you know, meeting Gilgamesh and Enkidu, before sort of having to be incorporated into this epic as a villain, you know, or as a sort of gateway to be sort of smashed down, you know. And so I really wanted to represent this like ancient sort of forest dweller who loves the music that the forest makes, loves the animals, talks to them, and the forest is really sort of a companion or a partner, you know. In the story, this character has 7 sons that also sort of meet their end to the hands of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. But I sort of read into that relationship between like this character, his sons having not names, but really the names of his children are onomatopoeias, like they're sounds that the forest makes. So I'm sort of thinking about this figure and the forest as sort of in this sort of in a sense like a matrimony, like they're in a partnership or a marriage or what may have you, you know, but it's a deep, intimate connection. And so making the pattern on the sort of green cloak was sort of thinking about the sort of different paths or regions to this forest. And then the sort of like underwater theme is sort of taking a forest out of its normal element of like being above ground, but being like inundated, like being underwater, you know. And there are forests that exist like underwater that, you know, you don't know about, you know, and that's where this character would be, you know, that's where he's chilling. So it's sort of like thinking about just those levels of stories and like how to retrieve them, you know.
That's a paint can?
Yeah, it's a paint can. I found that on the train tracks, like on the Amtrak.
Yeah, it's like a real crazy conversation too, like also too with like, as you were saying, like with artists that you were probably like, you know, thinking of at the time.
Yeah. I mean,
really appreciate that.
With this one, I was thinking about Rauschenberg a lot.
Yeah, I know. That's exactly what I was thinking too.
Yeah, legit.
Sick,
you know,
man.
so yeah, it was that like sort of like, oh, I could do that. Like
That's
I could just
awesome.
put some
Awesome.
other stuff in there. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, Jeffrey.
Congrats.
Thanks.
That looks good. So I'm thinking about some strange reason, like James Baldwin is kind of coming up in my mind a lot when I look at this work. And specifically, like, he has this theory that black artists like tend to use surrogates, or this idea of surrogacy. Like their way to speak about issues is by using surrogates. We never like directly say that.
Like an avatar,
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, one, you're kind of doing it like, I think, in a different kind of way, like this idea of like self-portraiture, like all of the people in your work are, I'm assuming, like images or representations of yourself. So I'm wondering, like, one, who are the people that these images, or even in your broader practice, like who do they stand in for? Like, who is the work about outside of you? And I'm also curious about like kind of like the conceptual underpinnings of Gilgamesh, kind of using that as like like ground for discussion. Like maybe we could elaborate a bit more on that.
I'll say that's a really excellent question, and I'll say that, you know, a lot of the strokes and gestures that you see in the work, they're coming out of you know, materials and processes that, you know, are sort of linked to a sense of cleaning, you know. So the broader strokes are made with a sponge, the, you know, spray bottle, like a Windex or something like that. You know, and, you know, my mom worked as a house cleaner when she immigrated to the United States. So it's sort of coming out of this idea of you know, this labor that's involved in sort of removing a mark, you know, removing a stain, removing a sort of imperfection. And so to sort of think about that while sort of, you know, having a sponge that's soaked in cyanotype to sort of, you know, on this clean white surface, and then to sort of put a mark there, you know, that won't go away, that's activated by sunlight, is definitely something that really influences the decisions I make in terms of gesture, in terms of my engagement with the surface. And then, you know, there's like other steps beyond that, but I think directly that's like the link that I make and that I'm really conscious of. And you know, the sort of the intellectual, the sort of underpinnings of thinking about Gilgamesh, really I was brought to this idea of doing a visual epic to this sort of written epic from Milton, because I studied Paradise Lost by John Milton, and I realized that, you know, Milton was writing really in the 1600s, basically from like the 1630s to up about like 1680 something, and during his time writing epic poetry and writing Paradise Lost and basically Paradise Lost is like a catalog of all the sort of Western myths. He never got the opportunity to read Gilgamesh because that was lost at that time, right? Like it wasn't something that was known to Europeans at the time. And Milton is really like the sort of like the like he's like my poet, you know, like in this sense. Not my only poet, but he's definitely like in the top 3. And you know, sort of wanting to engage with Milton in this way of like, you never got to read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you know, you never got to see sort of what this work did to me, you know, like what it could do to me. So it was sort of me being a fan of Milton and wanting to like follow through that, like being such a scholar of Paradise Lost and bringing that into Gilgamesh in a visual way, you know, and thinking about Milton was blind when he wrote Paradise Lost, and he had lost his vision. And what's really astounding about the poem is it's so visual, you know, like it's a sharper sense of images from this writer that literally didn't write it, he just spoke it, you know, every morning he'd just wake up and speak verses to his daughters that would then transcribe them. So it's like this, even that idea of collaboration, and then even that idea of what's lost is then can be like even internal. And so, you know, yeah, working with Gilgamesh, thinking about poetry, thinking about light in relation was just something that really like held my like attention for a long time, and I still don't know why, or you know, because I mean originally like I thought this project would be like, you know, a couple months, maybe a year tops, you know, but it really just kept my attention and kept me busy for a while. Yeah.
This is kind of like a weird, broad question, but like, how do you know when you're done, and how does that feel to you? Because like, looking at some of your pieces, it seems like there's a lot of time and different entry points that go into it. It doesn't look like you just had this one idea and like it was done. So like, what does that feel like for you when you know a piece is finished, or maybe they're not? I don't know.
It's a great question too. I mean, I feel like it depends on the piece.
Yeah.
It depends on the sort of intentionality behind it. Like the fabric piece is a different entry point than, let's say, the frame pieces or the piece with the strings.
Yeah.
You know, because the piece with the strings, like that was, you know, three or four times trying to make this composition happen. You know, cutting different sizes of paper, doing it at different scales, shooting myself in the studio in all these different postures, in different costumes, at different scale of the negative. So it was like really this like relationship, like trying to make a landscape like multi-portrait, you know, and I knew exactly what that looked like in my mind. And once I like saw that and made that final stitch, it was like, oh, okay, this is exactly what, well, not exactly, but this was like
this comes as close as
as close as it can get, you know, or even like beyond what I thought, you know. And then, you know, with like a piece like this is like a longer sort of like engagement of like basically talking to the work and being like, what do you want from me, you know, like what do you want me to do, you know, or what do you just want, you know, do you want, are you cold, do you want to clothe, like, do you want, you know, like, do you want to smile, do you want to frown, you know, like literally like I ask myself these questions out loud and I talk to the work, you know, because why not? It's just me in the studio, you know, I'm not crazy, it's just my space, you know, I can say whatever or do whatever I want. So it's that sort of level of engagement with the work, like in terms of a conversation that happens slowly over time. And then with the fabric piece that's hanging, that was like, you know, made in the backyard. One afternoon, Zach, our mutual best friend, came over, you know, we kicked it. He was like,
this backyard right here.
yeah, this Baxter Street backyard out back, and he was like, oh, this is cool, and it was like halfway done, and he was like, what's going on? I was like, I don't know. And you know, so even like his energy coming into the space, you know, it shifted things and impact. So it was like about being present, about being aware of like my hand, the level of energy I wanted to put into it, the level of texture that it has, really was influenced on like the kind of light that was hitting it as I was doing it. And that's an unexposed, that's an developed piece. It's not rinsed in water and it's not rinsed in hydrogen peroxide. So it's still collecting light and information and being exposed. It's still active, and it's still being worked on, you know. So it's sort of like something like that is like, in a sense, it's finished in terms of the gesture, but it's unfinished in terms of following through in the process and like washing it out and then like making it, you know, blue. But it has this different level of blue that's in this sort of like unfinished sense.
Gotcha.
You know.
Any more questions?
I just have one question, I guess.
Yeah.
I like the conversation you guys are having about how the fabric is creating this different space. And I know we can't see it in here, but at the opening you had the piece in the backyard that you, I think, made in the backyard too.
Yeah, I made it in the backyard.
If you could just talk a little bit more about that and sort of the process of making it, and when you were as you were making it, you were thinking about putting it there, or maybe in here, and what that process was.
Yeah, that piece in the backyard is sort of came out of another fabric, like sort of soft sculpture that I did, that was all sort of draping down and you can walk through it, and it was sort of these like blue strips. And I was just thinking about like sort of gravity and sort of like an interaction, like sort of an object sort of being able to like float or like be able to suspend or like basically be like the sky almost, like it's there but it's not, like you can't grab it, you know what I mean, like but you're in it and you walk through it every day, you know. And so this piece in the backyard was like me collaborating with a friend of mine, Peter Perry, that's a welder, and sort of we came up with this idea to sort of make just a frame for it, something to hold this, something heavy that would hold this lighter piece of fabric, but then the fabric had like these images on them that told a story about like migration, about sort of, in my research, sort of the ideas that I see in people, humans migrating constantly. And what sort of would drive a migration of people from one place to another. What drove my own family's migration from one place to here, you know. and then, you know, and sort of creating this space in which people could like walk like under and like look up and see the sort of story sort of unraveling as they turn and look around. But it had a motion sensor light on it, in which, you know, the light would be off, and then the closer you got to it, then this light would turn on that would sort of surprise you, and then also hopefully make you realize that like you have a sort of more so you're sort of called to attention to sort of look and sort of see glimpses of this narrative unfolding. And that's sort of in an ongoing series of soft sculptures, like fabric sculptures that I'm doing, that sort of really are back to this idea of like space and holding space, and I'm thinking about like cyanotypes linked to architecture, like really thinking about the ancient and sort of stories as soft and malleable to like enter and sort of reflect on your own sort of story, your own origin, you know, like where is your family from? Like, I don't mean like from, but like from, you know, like what's the earliest story in your family? Like we all have it, you know, and we all have access to it through our relatives, like, you know, if not grandmothers, like, or aunts, or, you know, uncles or whatever, like, you know, there's that sense of like, you know, our family came through this way or whatever, you know, and it's really a space to reflect on origin. Like there isn't really one origin to anybody's story, you know, but there's still a human need to sort of understand like where we're from, you know. We have these stories that are like origin stories, you know, like why? I never really understood that. So it's sort of like query, like just sort of trying to understand where that human need like for that comes from. You know?
Great.
Yeah. Danny, you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you guys. But I was just wondering, I was wondering what is the most recent piece that you worked on in here, and second, I was gonna ask if you have any thoughts and like ideas or direction that you want to explore next, something that you have been waiting to do. Like, is this part one of something that's coming later, or is this? I mean, no one knows really, but.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, in this particular space is the hanging fabric piece, and that was really created in response to the exhibition. So I sort of have this. I'm developing this method of like thinking about thinking about an exhibition as a site to be responded to, like it's an active site.
So we're gonna see you on the walls next to them like that?
You never know. You know, it's definitely possible. And just in terms of what's next, like there's so many things that are, you know, brewing and coming to fruition, and it's really amazing. But in terms of like this specific project, it's really thinking about animation, thinking about ways to make this experience like, you know, on screen that's like, you know, backlit or whatever, but thinking about like really bringing this story into a animated, you know, film space and seeing these characters move, because there's so many actions that aren't represented, you know, in the process. So it's like, you know, instead of like the 1,000 frames that I took to make this one piece, you know, instead of just like having that in my archive, like bringing it into an animation with sound, you know, with costumes, with, you know, all these other elements, to make it really a full experience. So yeah.
So I'm gonna close it up where we started, unless someone else has another question. But I just I thought it would be nice for you to kind of end on a note of how Derrick has influenced you, because I think it's such a beautiful dialogue that both of you have had, like this hybrid of influences.
Yeah.
So I think that touching directly on that would be really great.
I mean, Derrick's work is just really, really amazing, and I'm just like, no, it really is, and you know, it's it's, as a young artist, it's really great to sort of see your trajectory and see the way you engage with installation in so many different ways. Like, it's literally, it's like never what you would expect, and it's just so great to see how you conceive of a project and like distill it, you know. And thinking about like your project that you did with the Green Book, even like just sort of thinking about like a piece of literature and then how you distill that and make an experience and like make objects out of it and like allow people to engage with it in a way that, you know, they didn't have access to. Like, you know, I didn't have access to what that material actually was and how it was actually used in the 60s, you know. But in a sense, like, your exhibition allows for a bridge to that, you know. And then you can connect with like, you know, elder folks, ancestors, and then also see sort of as an artist how to sort of deal with, you know, material culture produced by people and then distill it in a way and make something new out of it, like make a new story and make new like stories possible for people, you know. So, and then even the work in which you yourself are in, you know, I mean, that's like a sort of like direct influence of like the earlier photographic work where, you know, you're in it and, you know, and you're like wearing these like, you know, sort of like they're black and white, they're like crossroads, like you know, and it's that, you know, and sort of like that, also that level of like, you know, engagement with the work and intimacy of like, you know, making yourself vulnerable and putting yourself out there, you know. And I can go on and like performance stuff, like, you know, you really
stop.
You really cover like a wide spectrum. But
I mean, I really think my experience as an artist, especially starting off, was really influenced by a lot of different artists. And one thing that really liberated me as a younger artist at a particular time was kind of like the beginning of social media culture. I had the pleasure and privilege to be around a lot of older artists, mostly African American artists, who are now being celebrated. But when I met them in my 20s, no one knew who they were except for people within the African American community or people who followed the artists. But one thing that I remember meeting them, because I used to work at a nonprofit gallery for like 13 years, and my job was to meet with these artists and meet with the photographer and photograph them. But in between all those different experiences or duties, I had the pleasure of speaking with them and hanging out with a lot of artists like Frank Bowling and Ed Clark and Herb Gentry and Al Loving and all these different artists at a particular time where they were not as favored within the contemporary art world. And they all have very interesting stories, Howard Dean and Pindellas as well, about their frustration with being an artist at a particular time. And for me, they were like amazing artists. I was like, oh my God, these are like, I'm so privileged to be having a beer with Frank Bowling or talking to Ed Clark. But one thing I took from them a lot is that they continue to make work, and they were not, the idea of success was something that they knew they deserved, but that did not stop them from being productive. And for me as a younger black artist, I thought that if I'm going to make art and not be upset about what I don't get from making art, then I have to be in love with the idea of making art by itself and not look for art as a form of success within the world. And that art, for me, had to be a therapeutic process, and that I could not look at art as a job, and that if I was going to continue making art, I would have to do other things in order to keep my art very sacred to me as an artist. And I never thought about, even in my time at Columbia, that I would be an artist in the level that I not that I thought that I wouldn't be successful, but I thought I was already successful. And, you know, getting into the program, I thought like, I'm already successful. So every step I felt like I succeeded in some ways. And so even today, I'm always surprised at just the outcome of support for projects. But I also think that working with all these different artists and seeing the way they work, because they actually came into the spaces where I worked to install their shows, I learned a lot just about how to place things and how to connect with people as they walk through the space. But I think the main thing is that I learned make work like no one's looking. And I think that kids do that. And I think that work is better because they do that. And I think that if we made work without thinking about people looking, then our work would be better. Because there's a certain level of self-consciousness that's happening within art now, because the level of control has shifted in the art world, and that the curators and collectors have more power than before. You know, just about like presentation and exposure. But I think that the work will continue to be better if, for everyone, if you made work just to make work, you know. And I think that will make it good. It will keep it good. I mean, because at least it'll be for you if no one else wants it, you know. So I think that, I mean, I would say that. And I think that's kind of part of I would say that's one of the success for me, because I won't do a project if I can't do what I really want to do. I won't. Because I think that is important for people. When people come to see the show, they're coming to see you, not the person who put you in the show.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So thank you for all being here.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank
There's
you.
still a little bit of wine if you want to talk to these guys. There's a bit of beer too. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, Ivan.